The Colorado mountain airfield stretched like a frozen graveyard beneath the morning sky, and Lieutenant Elena Torres had grown tired of being invisible. For 5 years, she'd watched pilots half her skill level climb into cockpits while she stayed grounded, relegated to the equipment hangar with her toolbox and maintenance logs. At 32, she was the head engineer of the base's helicopter division, a title that commanded respect until someone needed an actual pilot. Elena's daily routine never varied. 0500 hours, pre-flight inspections. 0700 hours, maintenance. Briefings. 0800 hours, watching other people fly the machines she kept airworthy. Every morning, she stood on the tarmac as helicopters lifted off, their rotors cutting through mountain air she'd never been allowed to taste from a pilot's seat. Torres, the Black Hawks need rotor adjustments before the afternoon training runs, Colonel Hayes called out, not bothering to look in her direction. The gray-bearded veteran had enough combat ribbons to wallpaper a room, and he treated Elena like expensive equipment, valuable, but not quite human. "Already completed, sir," Elena replied, wiping grease from her hands. "All aircraft are flight-ready." Hayes grunted acknowledgement and walked away, deep in conversation with Captain Rodriguez about flight schedules. Elena wasn't included in those discussions, despite knowing more about aircraft capabilities than anyone on base. She was the engineer, not the pilot. The distinction felt carved in stone. During lunch break, Elena retreated to her sanctuary, a small corner of the equipment hangar where she'd set up an unofficial office. Between helicopter parts and maintenance manuals, she kept a secret, advanced flight simulator software running on a borrowed computer. While other pilots grabbed coffee or played cards, Elena flew. Her simulation scores were perfect. Highland Station approach in winter storm conditions, completed flawlessly 11 times. Advanced tactical maneuvers mastered. Emergency procedures memorized, down to the millisecond. But perfection in virtual reality meant nothing when real rotors started spinning. "Still playing video games, Torres?" Staff Sergeant Martinez appeared in the doorway, her voice carrying a mix of amusement and concern. She was the only other woman in their unit, though she'd earned her stripes in communications, not aviation. "Training," Elena corrected, not. Looking away from the screen where she was executing a perfect auto-rotation landing in simulated zero visibility. Martinez stepped closer, watching Elena's hands move across the controls with practiced precision. "Your scores are better than most of our active pilots." "Scores don't matter if command never authorizes actual flight training. Have you requested authorization?" Elena finally looked up, her expression mixing frustration with resignation. 14 times in 5 years. Each request gets the same response. "Current pilot roster is sufficient for operational needs." Martinez studied her friend's face, recognizing the look of someone whose dreams were slowly dying from neglect. Maybe it's time to stop asking permission. Before Elena could respond, alarms began blaring across the base. Emergency lights flashed red, and the base-wide communication system crackled to life. "All senior personnel report to the briefing room immediately. We have a code red situation at Highland Medical Station." Elena's blood ran cold. Highland Station, the remote medical facility she'd studied obsessively in her simulations. The place where her father had died 15 years ago, attempting a rescue in impossible weather conditions. As senior personnel rushed toward the briefing room, Elena quietly followed at a distance. She wasn't invited to emergency briefings, but something told her this moment was different. This moment was exactly what she'd been preparing for, even if nobody else knew it yet. Through the briefing room's glass doors, she could see Colonel Hayes pointing at weather satellite imagery that looked like abstract art in white and gray. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the expressions: worry, concern, and the kind of fear that comes from impossible decisions. Elena pressed closer to the door, her heart pounding as she caught fragments of conversation. ... completely cut off ... medical supplies critically low ... no pilot willing to attempt ... Her father's voice echoed in her memory from their last conversation before his fatal mission. Flying isn't about proving you can do it, Mia. It's about knowing you must do it. Elena straightened her shoulders and reached for the briefing room door handle. For 5 years, she'd waited for permission to fly. Today, she was going to stop asking. The room fell silent as she stepped inside, every eye turning toward the engineer who just crashed their exclusive meeting. Colonel Hayes' face darkened with irritation. Torres, this is a restricted briefing. Return to your I can fly. It, Elena said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The silence that followed stretched like a wire about to snap. Then, slowly, the laughter began. The laughter started with Captain Rodriguez, a low chuckle that grew into something cruel. Torres, you've never flown anything outside virtual reality. This isn't some computer game where you get extra lives. More laughter rippled through the briefing room. Someone muttered about desk jockeys playing hero. Another voice called out, better stick to fixing things, not flying them. Elena stood perfectly still, absorbing every mocking sound like physical blows. She'd expected this reaction, but expectation didn't make it hurt less. These were men she'd worked alongside for 5 years, men whose aircraft she'd kept airworthy through countless missions, and they were laughing at her offer to risk her life. Colonel Hayes raised his hand for silence, though his expression remained skeptical. Torres, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we're talking about a Category 5 storm system. Winds gusting to 70 miles per hour, zero visibility, no ground navigation aids. This is a death sentence for experienced pilots, let alone. Sir, Staff Sergeant Martinez interrupted from the back of the room, her voice steady but firm. Lieutenant Torres has scored perfect on Highland Station approach simulations 3 consecutive years running. Her scores are higher than most of our active pilots. A pause, weighted with new information. Captain Rodriguez frowned. Simulations aren't reality, Martinez. Weather doesn't care about computer scores. Elena finally spoke, her voice carrying, despite its quietness. I've studied Highland Station terrain for my advanced engineering thesis. I've mapped every wind pattern, every thermal current, every approach vector in that mountain range. I know that route better than I know the roads around this base. Sergeant Willis, a helicopter mechanic with 20 years of experience, let out a dismissive sound. Studying maps and flying through hell are completely different things, honey. The word honey hung in the air like a slap. Elena felt her cheeks burn, but she maintained eye contact with Willis. You're right, Sergeant. They are different. But right now, studying is all we have, because everyone else is too afraid to try. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. These were combat veterans, men who'd flown through enemy fire and sandstorms, and she just called them cowards. Colonel Hayes stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. Lieutenant, you're walking a very thin line. So are the 127 people stranded at Highland Station, sir. Elena pulled out her phone and displayed the weather tracking app she'd been monitoring since dawn. The storm is moving east. We have a 6-hour window before it intensifies further. After that, those people aren't getting rescued. They're getting body bags. Commander Brooks, who'd been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly moved to the wall display. He called up a file that made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Flight simulator records, he announced, and Elena's heart nearly stopped. From the past 3 years. The room watched in growing amazement as Elena's simulation runs played on screen. Highland Station approach, winter storm conditions, impossible visibility, routes that would challenge veteran pilots. She'd completed the simulation flawlessly, not once, not twice, but 11 successful runs out of 11 attempts. Captain Rodriguez's expression shifted from mockery to something approaching respect. She wasn't requesting random simulator time. She was training for this exact scenario. Lieutenant Spencer, who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan and earned a Distinguished Flying Cross, spoke for the first time during the briefing. She wasn't training for recreation. She was training for Highland Station specifically. Elena felt every gaze in the room shift from skepticism to curiosity, but she also felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders like lead. Colonel Hayes looked directly at her, his gray eyes calculating. Why Highland Station, Torres? Why that specific approach? Elena's voice remained steady, but everyone could hear the emotion underneath. Because that's where my father died attempting a rescue mission in similar conditions 15 years ago. Because I promised myself that weather would never again prevent someone from reaching people who needed help. The room fell completely silent. Outside, wind howled against the windows like something alive and angry. Captain Rodriguez stood up slowly. He walked across the room, stopped directly in front of Elena, and looked into her eyes for a long moment. Then he turned to Colonel Hayes. Sir, I recommend Lieutenant Torres be immediately cleared for emergency flight authorization. One by one, other officers nodded agreement. The mechanic who'd called her Honey nodded. The operations officer who'd questioned her experience nodded. Even the communications specialist who'd seen the weather reports nodded. But Elena noticed something else in their faces: relief. Relief that someone else was willing to make the impossible choice they couldn't bring themselves to make. Colonel Hayes stepped forward with keys to UH-60 Black Hawk Helicopter Alpha 7. Torres, you are hereby granted full flight authorization under emergency protocols. Elena took the keys, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. The metal felt warm compared to everything else in this frozen world. As she walked toward the door, Captain Rodriguez called out, Torres? She turned back. May God go with you, because the rest of us sure as hell aren't coming. The honesty was brutal, but Elena appreciated it more than false encouragement. She walked through the briefing room, past officers who'd gone from mocking her to respecting her in the span of 30 minutes, knowing full well they expected her to die trying. Outside, Helicopter Alpha 7 waited like a sleeping giant in the falling snow. Elena stood alone in the equipment hangar after the briefing, the weight of Alpha 7's keys heavy in her palm. Through frosted windows, she could see the other officers, still arguing, gesturing at weather reports, shaking their heads. They'd given her authorization, but she could read their faces. They expected her to come to her senses and back down. From her jacket pocket, she pulled out a worn pilot's badge, silver wings tarnished with age, edges smooth from years of handling. Her father's badge, the one she'd never been officially given. Next to it, she unfolded a creased photograph. Captain Miguel Torres in full flight gear, standing beside his rescue helicopter before his final mission. He died 15 years ago flying through a storm just like this one, attempting to save a family trapped on a mountain ridge. The weather had been impossible. Every other pilot had refused to fly. He'd gone anyway. Elena traced the badge with her finger, feeling every scratch, every dent. The metal was cold, like everything else in this place that had never truly welcomed her. Her phone buzzed with a text from Martinez. Second thoughts? No shame in waiting for better weather. Elena stared at the message, then at her father's photograph. Waiting wasn't an option. People were dying while everyone calculated acceptable risk levels and debated insurance policies. She typed back, if not me, then who? Through the hangar doors, she watched Captain Rodriguez approach her helicopter, conducting his own inspection. He was checking her work. She realized making sure the aircraft was airworthy for a mission he wouldn't attempt himself. The gesture stung more than his earlier mockery. Elena's phone rang. Unknown number, but she answered anyway. Lieutenant Torres? This is Dr. Amanda Richardson from Highland Medical Station. The voice was strained, exhausted. I heard. Someone might be attempting a supply run. Yes, ma'am. I'll be departing. Within the hour. A pause, filled with static and hope. Lieutenant, we have people dying up here. Insulin running out. Emergency medications gone. A 7-year-old girl with diabetes who won't make it through the night without supplies. Elena closed her eyes, seeing her father's face. I understand, Doctor. I'm coming. Everyone here thinks it's impossible. The weather. Doctor, sometimes impossible is just another word for difficult. I'll see you soon. After hanging up, Elena found Colonel Hayes waiting outside the hangar. His expression was unreadable. Last chance to change your mind, Torres. This isn't about courage anymore. This is about suicide. Elena looked at the Black Hawk helicopter, its rotors heavy with ice, looking more like a monument than a machine. Sir, with respect, I didn't spend 5 years preparing for this mission just to back down when it mattered. Hayes studied her face. Your father was a good pilot. One of the best I ever served with. But not good enough for this weather. No, the storm killed him, Torres. Same kind of storm, same impossible conditions. Are you really so eager to follow his path? Elena met his gaze directly. I'm not following his path, sir. I'm finishing it. Hayes nodded slowly, then surprised her by extending his hand. Then make it count, Lieutenant. Make his sacrifice mean something. As Elena walked toward Alpha 7, she noticed something that made her stop cold. Every officer from the briefing had gathered on the tarmac, not to wish her luck, but to witness what they believed would be her final moments alive. Captain Rodriguez approached her with a clipboard. Pre-flight inspection complete. All systems green. He paused, then added quietly, I'm sorry about earlier. The laughter. You didn't deserve that. You were protecting your people from a dangerous decision, Elena replied. I respect that. No, Torres. I was protecting myself from admitting I was too scared to try. Elena climbed into the cockpit she'd dreamed of occupying for 5 years. The controls felt familiar from countless simulator hours, but the weight of reality was different. This wasn't a game she could restart if she failed. She began her final systems check, methodically verifying every component that would keep her alive in the storm. Then she paused at the radio controls and switched to base-wide frequency. Attention all personnel. This is Lieutenant Elena Torres. In Alpha 7, I want everyone to understand something clearly. Her voice carried across the base through every radio, every intercom system. I'm not doing this to prove anything to anyone. I'm not doing this because I have something to prove about women in aviation. I'm doing this because 127 people are counting on someone to try when everyone else says it's impossible. She paused, looking through her windscreen at the faces gathered on the tarmac. If I don't come back, don't let my death be meaningless. Don't let fear prevent the next person from stepping forward when lives are at stake. Elena switched back to flight control frequency. Tower, this is Alpha 7 requesting immediate departure clearance. A long pause then. Alpha 7, you are cleared for departure. Wind is gusting to 65 miles per hour. Visibility less than 100 meters. Good luck, Lieutenant. The rotors began to spin, cutting through morning air with a sound like approaching thunder. At exactly 0945 hours, Lieutenant Elena Torres lifted off into what could only be described as nature's fury. The world vanished in seconds. No horizon. Line, no landmarks, no reference points except the glowing instruments before her, and the violent shaking of the aircraft as mountain winds tried to tear it apart piece by piece. This was the hell that experienced pilots had refused to enter flying. Blind through a storm that seemed designed to kill anything foolish enough to challenge it. Behind her, the base disappeared into white void. Ahead lay Highland Station and 127 people who believed someone was finally coming to save them. Elena Torres was no longer the invisible engineer. She was the only pilot left in the sky. Base. This is Alpha 7. Elena's voice cut through radio static, steady despite the chaos surrounding her. Proceeding to Highland Station, ETA 25 minutes. The response was barely audible through interference. Ice was already forming on her antenna array, and she was only 15 minutes into the flight. At 8,000 feet, Elena was flying in a world that existed purely in white. No up, no down, no forward or back, just a violent shake of her aircraft and the green glow of instruments. Every weather pattern she'd studied, every topographical detail she'd memorized, every simulation she'd run came flooding back. She wasn't just flying. She was dancing with death at altitude, trusting muscle memory developed through countless hours of preparation that everyone had dismissed as fantasy. The first downdraft hit like a giant fist, dropping the helicopter 200 feet in 2 seconds. Elena's stomach jumped into her throat as she fought to regain altitude, her hands moving across controls with precision born from obsessive practice. Warning lights flickered as the aircraft strained against forces that wanted to smash it into the mountainside below. "Come on, beautiful," she murmured to the Black Hawk, feeling it respond to her touch like something alive. "We're gonna make it." Through her headset, she could hear fragments of base communications. Someone was tracking her progress on radar. Someone else was calculating fuel consumption rates. Someone was praying. She could hear the whispered words through an open microphone. At 15 minutes into the flight, the lightning began. The first bolt struck 100 yards to her left, turning the white void into a brilliant explosion of electric blue. The helicopter lurched sideways like a wounded animal, and Elena fought to maintain control as turbulence tried to flip them upside down. The second bolt was much closer. Elena saw it coming, a massive fork of pure energy, reaching down from storm clouds like the finger of an angry god. She banked hard right, pulling every G-force the helicopter could handle, but physics and timing conspired against her. The lightning struck their tail rotor assembly with the force of a bomb. Every warning light in the cockpit blazed red. Alarms screamed like tortured souls. The helicopter began spinning wildly, its damaged tail rotor unable to counter the main rotor's torque. Electrical systems began failing one by one. Back at base, Elena's radio signal disappeared into static. "We've lost her," someone whispered in the control room, the words carrying the weight of a death sentence. Colonel Hayes stared at the radar screen, watching Elena's transponder signal flicker and fade like a dying star. For 2 agonizing minutes, that felt like hours. There was nothing but static and the terrible knowledge that they might have sent a brave woman to die alone in the storm. Then, crackling through interference like a voice from another world, "Base, this is Alpha 7. Still airborne. Adjusting trajectory for tail rotor damage." The control room erupted. Officers were shouting, laughing, some wiping away tears they'd never admit to shedding. Elena Torres was alive damaged, but alive. But survival and success were different things entirely. With her tail rotor crippled and instruments failing, Elena was flying on pure instinct now. She dropped altitude dangerously low, using mountain ridges as windbreaks, following valleys she'd memorized from topographical maps during sleepless nights of preparation. The snow was so thick she couldn't see her own rotor blades. She flew by feel, sensing the aircraft's responses through her fingertips. reading wind patterns through vibrations in her seat, navigating by subtle changes in engine sound that told her when she was flying over rock, trees, or empty air. Through her damaged headset, she could hear fragments of radio chatter from base. People were praying. People were holding their breath. People were counting on her to do something that had just become exponentially more difficult. Her fuel gauge showed critical levels. Her hydraulic systems were operating at 60% capacity. Her navigation equipment was completely unreliable. But Elena pressed forward, guided by a promise she'd made to a little girl who needed insulin and a father who died trying to reach the same destination 15 years earlier. 28 minutes after takeoff, Highland Medical Station appeared through the storm like a miracle wrapped in white. Elena brought the crippled helicopter down in a landing that was equal parts skill and desperation. The moment her skids touched frozen ground, the emergency medical team came running through knee-deep snow. But it wasn't the medical team that stopped Elena's heart. It was the little girl, maybe 7 years old, who broke away from the group and ran straight toward the helicopter, arms waving above her head like she was greeting a returning hero. "I knew you'd come," the child shouted over the rotor noise, her voice carrying pure joy and absolute faith. "Mama said angels never give up, and you're our angel." Elena shut down the engines, her hands finally starting to shake as adrenaline began to fade. She climbed out of the cockpit in the blinding snow and bitter wind, carrying medical supplies that meant the difference between life and death for 127 people. The little girl grabbed her hand with snow-covered mittens. "Are you scared?" Elena knelt down so they were eye to eye, this pilot and this child who believed in angels. "Every time I fly," she said honestly, "but I'm more scared of what happens if nobody tries." The girl nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense in her world where heroes existed and miracles were possible. "Will you come back if we need you again?" Elena looked at her damaged helicopter, at the medical team loading patients for evacuation, at this child who'd never doubted that help would come. "Always," she promised. The flight back to base was marginally easier. The storm was moving east, leaving patches of clear sky like windows in a wall of white. Elena nursed her damaged aircraft home, coaxing it through mountain passes with the gentle touch of someone who understood that machines, like people, sometimes just needed encouragement to do the impossible. As she approached base airspace, Elena expected a routine landing and debriefing. What she found instead was the entire unit waiting in the snow. Through her cracked windscreen, she could see everyone: officers, enlisted soldiers, maintenance crews, kitchen staff, communications personnel. They stood in formation on the snow-covered tarmac like an honor guard. Elena shut down the engines and sat in the cockpit for a moment that stretched like eternity. 4 hours of high-stress flying had left her flight suit soaked with sweat. Despite the freezing air, her hands trembled slightly from exhaustion and leftover adrenaline. She climbed down from the helicopter on legs that felt disconnected from her body. The crowd stood in complete silence, just watching. Then Lieutenant Spencer, the Afghanistan veteran who'd supported her during the briefing, stepped forward and began to clap. Slowly, deliberately, with the kind of respect reserved for something extraordinary. One by one, others joined him. The applause grew like thunder rolling across mountain peaks, echoing off hangar walls, becoming something bigger than individual recognition. It was acknowledgement of courage, of competence, of someone proving every doubter wrong. Captain Rodriguez approached with his cap in his hands, his face carrying an expression Elena had never seen directed at her pure respect. "I was wrong," he said simply, his voice carrying across the tarmac. "Dead wrong. And I just witnessed the finest flying I've seen in 23 years of military service." Colonel Hayes stepped forward carrying a satellite phone. "Torres, the Pentagon wants to speak with you." The Secretary of Defense is personally on the line. What followed was a whirlwind Elena had never imagined possible. The Department of Defense announced she would receive the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary heroism under combat-like conditions. Her helmet camera footage became required, viewing at every military flight training facility in the nation. Social media exploded overnight. Hashtag She Flew It became a trending hashtag worldwide. The audio recording of her calm, still airborne transmission was played on news channels from CNN to BBC World Service, becoming a symbol of grace under pressure. Flight schools from civilian institutions to elite military academies began using her mission as a case study in crisis management and advanced piloting techniques. Her simulator scores were analyzed, her approach vectors studied, her decision-making process dissected by experts who wanted to understand how she'd succeeded where others had failed. But the moment that mattered most to Elena came 3 days later, during a press conference she'd tried desperately to avoid. The Pentagon press room was packed with reporters, cameras, and military brass. Elena sat at a table feeling more nervous than she'd been flying through the storm, at least in the helicopter. She'd known what she was doing. A veteran war correspondent in the front row asked the question everyone was thinking. "Lieutenant Torres, how are you not terrified during that flight?" Elena looked directly into the cameras, thinking of that little girl at Highland Station, thinking of her father's photograph, thinking of every person who'd ever been told they weren't capable of extraordinary things. "I was absolutely terrified," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "But I realized I was more afraid of what would happen if nobody tried than I was of the storm itself." The room fell silent. Pens stopped moving. Cameras focused tighter. "Fear doesn't disqualify you from doing something important," she continued. "Fear is information. It tells you that what you're about to do matters. The question isn't whether you're scared. It's whether you're more afraid of action or inaction." A seasoned correspondent who'd covered 3 wars put down his pen and started clapping. Within seconds, the entire press corps was on their feet, reporters, camera operators, even the security personnel. But Elena was already thinking past the ceremonies. She was thinking about the young pilots she'd been asked to mentor, about the next impossible mission that would need someone willing to fly into uncertainty, about changing a system that had kept capable people grounded for too long. Recognition felt good, but purpose felt better. That evening, alone in her quarters, Elena received a package with no return address. Inside was a drawing from the little girl at Highland Station, a helicopter with actual wings flying through clouds shaped like hearts. The note read, "Thank you for being our angel. P.S. I want to be a pilot too. Will you teach me?" Elena pinned the drawing next to her father's photograph and smiled for the first time since this whole adventure began. Tomorrow she would return to work. Tomorrow there would be new challenges, new doubters, new opportunities to prove that capability comes in many forms. But tonight, she was simply Lieutenant Elena Torres, the woman who'd flown into a storm when everyone else said it was impossible. 1 month after Highland Station, Elena returned to the equipment hangar where her story had begun. But everything was different now. The same tools hung on the same walls. The same helicopters waited for maintenance. But Elena Torres was no longer invisible. "Ma'am," a young recruit asked, hand raised tentatively during her first training session. "Is it true you'd never flown a real helicopter before the Highland Station mission?" Elena smiled, remembering her own days of endless questions and burning curiosity. "It's true I'd never been given the opportunity, but I'd been preparing for that opportunity every single day for 5 years." She pulled out a letter that had arrived that morning, the 4th one this week from Highland Station. The little girl who'd called her an angel had drawn another picture, a formation of helicopters, all piloted by women, flying through clear blue skies. The note read, "I'm studying math extra hard so I can be a pilot like you. My teacher says girls can fly anything if they work hard enough." Elena pinned the drawing to the bulletin board next to her father's photograph, creating a small gallery of dreams and determination. "Here's what I need you to understand," she told the recruits, meeting each young face in turn. "They laughed when I said I could fly. They doubted when I stepped forward. They questioned when I took the controls." She paused, letting the words settle. "And then they watched me disappear into the storm and come back with lives saved." The laughter stopped. The doubts ended. The questions became respect. A young woman in the back row raised her hand. "What if they never give us the chance, ma'am?" Elena's answer came immediately, born from years of waiting and preparing. "Then you get ready anyway. You train anyway. You study anyway. Because when your moment comes, and it will come, you'll be ready to seize it." But Elena's real work was just beginning. 3 weeks later, she found herself in Colonel Hayes's office, facing a situation she'd never anticipated. On his desk lay a stack of transfer requests, 17 in total, all from female personnel across different military bases who'd heard about Highland Station. "They want to transfer here to work under your command," Hayes said, his tone unreadable. "Engineers, mechanics, communication specialists. Some with pilot training, some without. All requesting assignment to your unit." Elena studied the requests, recognizing names from news interviews and social media posts. These were women who'd been waiting for someone to prove it was possible. "Sir, I'm just a lieutenant. I don't have command authority over." "Actually, Torres, you do." Hayes pulled out an official document with Pentagon letterhead. "Effective immediately, you're being promoted to captain and assigned to develop a new pilot training program, specifically for underutilized personnel. Your mandate is to identify capable individuals who've been overlooked by traditional selection processes." Elena stared at the promotion orders, then at the transfer requests. "They're creating a program because of Highland Station. They're creating a program because you proved their assumptions wrong." Hayes leaned back in his chair. "The Secretary of Defense wants to know how many other Elena Torres are sitting in equipment hangars, maintenance bays, and communication centers across the military." That afternoon, Elena found herself in the same briefing room where she'd been laughed at just months earlier. But this time, she was the one standing at the front, addressing a room full of officers who hung on her every word. "The Highland Station mission revealed a critical gap in our operational readiness," she began, clicking to the first slide of her presentation. "We had a crisis that required immediate aviation response, and our entire pilot roster was unwilling or unable to attempt the mission." Captain Rodriguez, the same man who'd questioned her abilities, now nodded in agreement. "The candidate pool was too narrow. We were selecting pilots based on traditional criteria that may have excluded qualified personnel." Elena advanced to the next slide, showing simulator scores from across the base. "Hidden in plain sight, we have maintenance personnel, engineers, and support staff with exceptional aptitude for aviation. They've been training on their own time, developing skills we never bothered to evaluate." She clicked again, revealing names and scores that made several officers lean forward in surprise. "Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, helicopter mechanic perfect. Scores on advanced flight simulation. Specialist Michael Chun, communications completed aeronautical engineering degree on his own time. Corporal Lisa Rodriguez, logistics, has been taking civilian pilot lessons for 3 years." The room buzzed with recognition. These weren't random names. These were people the officers worked with daily, people whose potential had been invisible until someone looked. The new program will identify, evaluate, and train personnel who demonstrate aviation aptitude regardless of their current military occupation specialty, Elena continued. We're going to expand our pilot capabilities by recognizing talent wherever we find it. Lieutenant Spencer raised his hand. What's the timeline for implementation? Training begins next month. First class of 12 candidates selected from over 200 applicants across 6 bases. After the briefing, Elena walked across the base to the equipment hangar. But this time, she wasn't alone. Following behind her were 5 other women, the advanced team of transfers who'd arrived that morning. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, the helicopter mechanic with perfect simulation scores, fell into step beside Elena. Captain, permission to speak freely, always. Highland Station changed everything for us. Not just because you proved it could be done, but because you proved they'd listen when we did it. Elena looked at the women walking with her: an engineer, a mechanic, a communications specialist, a logistics coordinator, and a meteorologist. All with hidden aviation skills, all tired of being overlooked. The system didn't change overnight. Elena warned them. There will still be doubters, still be people who think we got here because of politics rather than ability. Jennifer smiled grimly. Let them think that. We'll be too busy flying to care about their opinions. As they reached the hangar, Elena felt a familiar sensation, the weight of opportunity mixed with the burden of expectation. But this time, she wasn't carrying it alone. Tomorrow, real change would begin. Tomorrow, the system that had kept capable people grounded would start to crack open. 6 months after Highland Station, Captain Elena Torres stood before a Congressional subcommittee on military readiness, facing questions that would determine the future of military aviation training. The ornate hearing room was packed with reporters, military officials, and advocates who'd followed her story from a laughed-at engineer to the face of systemic change. Captain Torres, Senator Patricia Williams began, leaning into her microphone. Your Highland Station mission has sparked significant debate about personnel utilization in our armed forces. Some critics argue that emergency situations aren't appropriate measures for evaluating training protocols. How do you respond? Elena had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but the question still carried weight that pressed on her shoulders. Senator, with respect, emergencies are exactly when training protocols matter most. Highland Station didn't prove I was an exceptional pilot. It proved that our system for identifying pilots was fundamentally flawed. She gestured to a chart displayed on the room's main screen. In the 6 months since Highland Station, the expanded training program has identified 347 personnel across all branches with advanced aviation aptitude. These individuals were previously classified as non-flight personnel. And their success rate? Senator Williams prompted. 93% completion rate for initial certification. Average training time 20% faster than traditional. Pipeline candidates. 0 safety incidents. A murmur ran through the hearing room. These numbers challenged decades of military aviation assumptions. Senator Robert Hayes, no relation to her former colonel, leaned forward with barely concealed skepticism. Captain, critics argue that your program creates artificial diversity quotas that compromise operational readiness. How do you ensure that political correctness doesn't override safety considerations? Elena had expected this attack. Senator, I'd like you to meet some of the artificial diversity. She gestured to the gallery, where 12 pilots stood in dress uniform. Captain Jennifer Walsh, formerly a helicopter mechanic, completed advanced search and rescue certification in record time. Lieutenant Michael Chun, formerly communications, flew successful combat missions in Syria last month. Major Lisa Rodriguez, formerly logistics, now leads night vision training for the entire Eastern Command. Alana's voice carried across the hearing room with quiet authority. These aren't diversity hires, Senator. These are the most qualified pilots we've ever produced. We just had to look beyond our assumptions to find them. Senator Hayes shuffled. his papers, clearly uncomfortable with the response. "But surely you understand the concerns about lowering standards." "We didn't lower standards," Elena interrupted, her composure cracking slightly. "We raised them." The traditional pilot selection process eliminated candidates based on factors that had nothing to do with flying ability, previous military occupation, gender, educational background, even height requirements that excluded perfectly capable individuals. She clicked to the next slide, showing side-by-side comparison data. Our new candidates average 15% higher on technical assessments, 20% better on crisis decision-making simulations, and show superior adaptability under stress. They're not meeting our old standards, they're exceeding them. The hearing room fell silent as the implications settled. For decades, military aviation had been selecting pilots using criteria that actively excluded some of their best candidates. Senator Williams leaned forward. "Captain Torres, what you're suggesting is that the military has been systematically wasting human resources for generations." "That's exactly what I'm suggesting, Senator. And Highland Station proved it wasn't just wasteful, it was dangerous. We had a crisis that required immediate aviation response, and our entire qualified pilot roster was unavailable or unwilling to attempt the mission. If we'd maintained broader pilot certification, if we'd recognized talent in unexpected places, those 127 people wouldn't have spent 4 additional hours believing they'd been abandoned." The weight of her words hung in the air like smoke. Elena could see reporters frantically taking notes, military officials shifting uncomfortably, and advocates nodding with recognition. Senator Hayes made one final attempt. "Captain, don't you think it's convenient that your program happens to benefit people who look like you? Doesn't this appear to be personal rather than professional?" Elena stood up slowly, her dress uniform bearing ribbons that included the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, and 3 commendation medals earned in the months since Highland Station. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd risked everything and succeeded. "Senator Hayes, my program benefits people who can fly. Period. If those people happen to include women, minorities, and individuals from non-traditional backgrounds. That's not because I'm pushing an agenda, it's because talent doesn't discriminate, even when our selection processes do." She gestured again to the gallery. "Every pilot standing behind me earned their wings through the same rigorous training, the same demanding standards, the same life or death evaluations. The only difference is that we bothered to give them the chance." Elena paused, looking directly at Senator Hayes. "As for this being personal, you're absolutely right. It became personal the moment I realized that my father might still be alive. If the military had been willing to look beyond traditional pilot profiles 15 years ago. It became personal when I watched capable people get dismissed without evaluation. It became personal when I saw children at Highland Station who believed they'd been forgotten." The hearing room was completely silent now. "But personal motivation doesn't invalidate professional results," Elena continued. "The data speaks for itself. The mission success rates speak for themselves. The lives saved speak for themselves." She sat down, her statement complete. The senators exchanged glances, clearly grappling with evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about military personnel management. 3 hours later, after additional testimony from program graduates and statistical analysis from Pentagon officials, the subcommittee reached their conclusion. Based on the evidence presented, Senator Williams announced, "This committee recommends immediate expansion of the Torres Protocol, the Enhanced Aviation Aptitude Program to all branches of military service. Further, we recommend comprehensive review of personnel selection processes across all military occupational specialties." Elena felt a mix of triumph and exhaustion. She'd won the fight, but she also understood that winning was just the beginning. As she left the hearing room, Surrounded by reporters and well-wishers, Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Highland Station. It was a photo from the little girl who'd called her an angel, now 8 years old, sitting in the cockpit of a civilian training aircraft, wearing a pilot's headset and grinning at the camera. The message read, "First flying lesson today. The instructor says, I'm a natural. Thank you for showing me that angels can be pilots too." Elena smiled, remembering her promise to always come back when needed. The system had changed, opportunities had expanded, and a new generation of pilots was taking to the sky. But the real victory wasn't institutional, it was personal. Every time someone who'd been overlooked got their chance to fly, Highland Station mattered a little more. 2 years after Highland Station, Captain Elena Torres returned to the Colorado Mountain Airfield for the last time as its commanding officer. She'd been selected to lead the new National Aviation Training Center, a facility designed to implement the Enhanced Aviation Aptitude Program across all military branches. The base looked different now. The equipment hangar where she'd once hidden with her simulator had been converted into the Torres Training Center. The briefing room where she'd been laughed at now hosted graduation ceremonies for pilots who never would have been considered under the old system. Elena walked through the hangar one final time, running her fingers along the maintenance stations where she'd once felt invisible. On the wall, a new display case held artifacts from her journey: her father's pilot badge, the Highland Station mission helmet camera, and dozens of drawings from children whose lives had been touched by the program. "Captain Torres?" A voice called from behind her. Elena turned to see a young woman in flight coveralls, no more than 19, with determined eyes that reminded Elena of herself years earlier. "I'm Cadet Amy Johnson," the young woman said. "I'm starting pilot training next week under the Enhanced program. I wanted to thank you before you left." Elena studied the cadet's face, seeing hunger and hope in equal measure. "Thank me for what?" "For making it possible. I'm from a small town in Montana, daughter of a single mother who works 2 jobs. Under the old system, I never would have been considered for pilot training. No military family, no aviation background, no connections. Just test scores and simulator time I earned working nights at a flight school." Elena smiled, remembering her own nights spent secretly training. The scores were enough? More than enough. "I scored perfect on the Highland Station simulation sequence." Elena's breath caught. The Highland Station approach had become the gold standard evaluation for the enhanced program, a test that measured not just technical skill, but decision-making under impossible pressure. "How many times did you run it?" 57 attempts before I got it perfect," Amy said proudly. "Then I ran it perfect another 20 times to make sure it wasn't luck." Elena laughed, recognizing the obsessive preparation that had defined her own journey. "What do you want to fly?" "Search and rescue," Amy answered without hesitation. "I want to be the person who shows up when everyone else says it's impossible." Elena felt a familiar emotion, the torch being passed to someone who truly understood its weight. "Cadet Johnson, let me give you some advice that someone should have given me years ago." Amy straightened, ready to absorb every word. "They're going to doubt you. Not because you're not capable, but because you don't fit their expectations of what a pilot looks like. Some of that doubt will come from people who should know better. Some will come from people who are threatened by change." Elena paused, looking at the young woman who represented everything the enhanced program was designed to achieve. "But here's what I learned at Highland Station. Doubt is just noise. Results are what matter. When you're sitting in that cockpit, facing conditions that would ground other pilots, when people are counting on you to attempt what others won't try, none of the doubt matters anymore. Only your training matters. Only your courage matters." Amy nodded solemnly. "And if I fail?" "Then you fail attempting something important." But based on your Highland Station scores, failure isn't your biggest risk. Your biggest risk is succeeding so well that people forget how hard you had to work to get the chance. Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a small wrapped package. This belonged to my father. He died attempting a rescue mission at Highland Station 15 years ago. I carried it with me during my mission there, and I've carried it ever since. Amy unwrapped the package to reveal the silver pilot's wings, tarnished with age, but still gleaming with significance. I can't accept this, Amy whispered. It's too important. It's important because it represents something bigger than any individual pilot, Elena replied. It represents the promise that when people need help, someone will be willing to try. My father carried that promise. I carried it. Now I'm passing it to you. Amy clutched the wings with reverence, understanding their weight. Captain Torres, will you be at my graduation? Elena smiled. I'll be there. And when you get your first impossible mission, when everyone says the conditions are too dangerous and the risk too high, remember Highland Station. Remember that someone before you faced the same choice and decided that trying was better than giving up. 6 months later, Elena stood at the podium of the National Aviation Training Center's inaugural graduation ceremony. Before her sat 127 new pilots, a number she'd chosen deliberately to honor Highland Station. They came from every background imaginable: former mechanics, communication specialists, logistics coordinators, engineers, and support staff who'd been overlooked by traditional selection processes. In the front row, Cadet Amy Johnson wore her dress uniform with Elena's father's wings pinned prominently above her name tag. She'd not only graduated first in her class, but had broken every search and rescue training record in the program's history. 2 years ago, Elena began, her voice carrying across the auditorium filled with families, military officials, and media representatives. I stood in the briefing room and said 4 words that changed my life. I can fly it. She looked out at the graduating class, seeing herself reflected in their eager faces. Everyone laughed. They said I was unqualified, unprepared, unrealistic. They said it was impossible for someone like me to attempt what trained pilots wouldn't try. Elena paused, letting the weight of memory settle. But impossible is just another word for untested. Every person in this graduating class was once told they weren't pilot material. Every person here was once overlooked, dismissed, or ignored by a system that couldn't see past its own assumptions. She gestured to the graduates. Today, you're not just receiving your wings. You're proving that talent exists everywhere, that courage comes in every form, and that when lives are on the line, capability matters more than convention. The ceremony concluded with the traditional first salute, but Elena had added a new tradition. Each graduate received a small card with coordinates 37.2431N, 107.8757W Highland Station. Remember these numbers, Elena told them. They represent the place where someone like you proved that sometimes the most underestimated person is exactly the right person for the impossible job. As the ceremony ended and families gathered around their newly minted pilots, Elena felt someone tap her shoulder. She turned to find a familiar face, Dr. Amanda Richardson from Highland Station, now in her 60s, but still carrying the energy of someone who saved lives for a living. Captain Torres, Dr. Richardson said, tears in her eyes. I had to be here today. I had to see what grew from that terrible storm 2 years ago. Elena embraced the doctor who'd been on the other end of that desperate phone call. How's the little girl? The one with diabetes? Dr. Richardson laughed through her tears. She's 10 now. Healthy, brilliant, and absolutely determined to become a pilot. She says she's going to fly bigger storms than you did. Elena looked around the graduation celebration at new pilots being congratulated by families who'd never imagined their children would have this opportunity, and military officials who'd learned to look for talent in unexpected places, at a system that had fundamentally changed because someone had been willing to step forward when everyone else stepped back. "Maybe she will," Elena said. "Maybe she'll face conditions that make Highland Station look easy. But she'll be ready for it, because she knows that someone like her has done it before." As the sun set over the National Aviation Training Center, Elena Torres walked to her car, knowing that her real mission was complete. Highland Station had saved 127 lives in a single day. But the program that grew from that mission would save thousands of lives over decades, flown by pilots who might never have gotten their chance under the old system. Her phone buzzed with a text from Amy Johnson, now Lieutenant Johnson, reporting for her first assignment with the 41st Search and Rescue Squadron. "Captain Torres, just received my first impossible mission. Weather's bad, location's dangerous. Everyone says it can't be done. Guess what I told them?" Elena smiled and typed back, "I can fly it? Exactly. See you on the other side of impossible." Elena put her phone away and looked up at the sky where the first stars were becoming visible. Somewhere up there, new pilots were learning to navigate by instruments and instinct. Somewhere, people in trouble were counting on someone to attempt what others wouldn't try. And somewhere, a 10-year-old girl was studying math extra hard, preparing for her own moment to step forward and say those 4 life-changing words, "I can fly it." The system had laughed at Elena Torres. Then they watched her disappear into the storm. And when she came back, everything changed. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever watched someone prove the world wrong? Share your story in the comments below. This is a place for voices that once got silenced. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.